Packet Protector is sponsored today by Meter. Meter delivers full stack networking infrastructure from wired to wireless to cellular in a single integrated solution that scales from branch offices, warehouses, and large campuses to data centers. Go to meter.com/packetprotector to book a demo now. That's meter.com/packetprotector to book a demo.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Jennifer J.J. Manella with my co-host, Drew Conry Murray. A few weeks ago, I guess it's been several weeks ago, we did an episode, I think it was 65, on microsegmentation, and we invited listeners to reach out, and let's keep that conversation going. So today's guest did that. Philip Griffiths is head of strategic sales at NetFoundry. However, this is not a sponsored show about NetFoundry. Philip is also involved in a working group with the Cloud Security Alliance, and over there, he's been working on updates to the software-defined perimeter guidance, and then there's also this new set of microsegmentation white papers that's not out quite yet, but he's going to give us some teasers into that.
Yeah, we talk about, sort of trying to get a working definition of microsegmentation because as far as JJ, you and I are, there's no like official sort of standards body definition.
I can get behind his definition, though. I do like it.
So we try to work up kind of what do we mean by microsegmentation. There's also a close coupling with zero trust. We get into a little bit about eBPF, what it can do in microsegmentation, the critical role of identity in microsegmentation and zero trust, segmenting things versus people versus services versus applications. We get a very brief overview of what software-defined perimeter is and mutual TLS, and then a quick plug for OpenZD and some open source platforms and some contact info for Philip if you enjoyed this conversation. So stick around. We're gonna microsegment. So Philip, welcome to the podcast. And just to get us started, what is your relationship with the Cloud Security Alliance?
Thank you for having me. So I've been involved with the CSA for a few years. Originally, it was just kind of getting to know the organization, talking to people, reading some of the papers. And as I engaged more, I saw there were working groups, got involved in some of them around zero trust. Recently, most of my attention has been in the subgroup of zero trust. We've been working on doing updates to the software-defined perimeter architecture and set of papers, which dovetails a lot into zero trust and microsegmentation. And then simultaneously, there's a whole bunch of work going on around a microsegmentation paper within the CSA. And then I jump into a few other topics. There was one around applying zero trust to OT recently that I got involved in. There was another one around IoT. There's an ongoing one at the moment around IT-OT convergence, running workloads in the cloud, but still interoperating with OT. So basically getting involved, doing some reviewing, having some opinions, doing some writing, bit of editing, and various community activities.
Okay. So our topic today then is microsegmentation. How do you define microsegmentation?
There's a lot of ways. It's almost like you have to find zero trust. Depends who you ask. For me, in fact, I got a big conversation on Reddit on this the other day because someone was telling me that microsegmentation was it wasn't a network control; it was just a security control. To which I was like, "Whoa, dude! There's a big difference between segmentation and microsegmentation." To me, it's the practice of isolating workloads, processes, and users into smaller and smaller zones while enforcing least privilege principles. And ideally building that around identity, context, continuous authentication. And then it's just a question of what enforcement layer are we doing this? Are we infrastructure? Are we network? Are we workload? Are we identity overlay? Are we east-west? Are we north-south? Are we IT? Are we OT? Fundamentally, it's isolating workloads and processes rather than just, hey, I've created a network segment with my host-based firewall, as this person on Reddit was saying, to which I massively disagreed with.
And I'm sure we'll put a link in the show notes here. I really enjoyed reading this Reddit thread and your responses, and frankly, some of the stuff I didn't quite follow, so you might have to talk us through it. But one of the things I think was interesting was that you were kind of making you were distinguishing between whether the, whatever you want to call it, the tunnel or connection ended at like an IP, a NIC, a socket within a service or a microservice. Can you talk through that just a little bit? I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole, but I think as we talk about microsegmentation and zero trust, especially for a networking and security audience, that's a good kind of teaser.
So at first I was like, "Whoa! How did you randomly find this Reddit thread?" Because this was like yesterday. So I get on Reddit a lot.
Oh, maybe this is a different Reddit thread.
It actually is, but it's just as relevant.
Okay.
Because this one started because someone lumped the company that I work for together with a VPN provider and said, "Hey, these are zero trust network overlays." And I was like, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa!" Like, I like their technology, but it's a better VPN. It's not proper zero trust and micro segmentation, because it's very much bringing traffic to a host using access control lists and just saying, okay, go along packet to wherever is now allowed within the network. As I commented in the post, identity dies on the NIC. And to me, when you're doing zero trust and micro segmentation properly, you have to maintain that identity all the way to the service and the process that you're trying to access. And so you really have to be either inside or around that process on the same host. And therefore, this comes to the distinction as to whether you are properly extending those micro segmentation principles to the services, the users, the workloads which you're looking to connect, or not. At 50,000 feet, anyone can say anything in marketing. But when the rubber hits the road, there's certain things you need to do to actually deliver micro segmentation, in my opinion.
Yeah. So can you talk about that a little bit more then?
I guess this is where you start to get into the intersection of microsegmentation and zero trust principles. If we look at the underlying principles of zero trust, which to me, microsegmentation is part of the framework as to how we can implement those capabilities. You're really looking at having strong cryptographic identity. You're looking at having least privilege access controls, whether that's role-based access control or ideally attribute-based access control. You're looking at having continuous authentication authorization. You're looking at having continuous monitoring and telemetry from that. And so this then interlinks into how you actually deliver microsegmentation. And as I was alluding to earlier, what level you then do that, how you implement it, definitely changes a few aspects of that, because you can do it at an infrastructure level, you can do it at a workload level, you can be doing it at a data level, and there's different pros and cons and how things then all interlink. But fundamentally, to properly do it, you have to have the identity. You have to be enforcing to the actual services that people are connecting. Like, the big bugbear for me, going back to that whole VPN comment, when people say to me, or any technologies using IP addresses, not microsegmentation. IP addresses do not map to the application, like, at all, period. Yeah, we might try to build some automation around things like we've done with SD-WAN and other network technologies to kind of make it a bit easier. But fundamentally, if you want to do microsegmentation, you need identities, policies, and services. How you implement it, that's a whole different basket of options, but you need those underlying core capabilities and principles.
And I think that's one of the big differences. So I think as we said in the intro, what spurred part of this conversation was back around episode 65. Drew and I just did a no guess, like, primer on microsegmentation for a network security audience, and just trying to kind of like set the expectation that, the microsegmentation terminology came out of data center workload segmentation. And then the networking vendors all went, "Oh, that sounds cool. We think we do that too." And what I was, trying to do is have the conversation with Drew about, they are different. And I think one of the big differences there's a lot of differences. You were just described, like, getting that control with identity at the application layer. But I think one of the things you've said 2 or 3 times now, that's a differentiator, is that identity and continuous authentication. And I'm a little bit curious about what that looks like in I'm going to air quote true microsegmentation space, where we're not talking about, hey, we're doing, dynamic ACLs and we're still doing things that are IP based, but getting into actual, like, workload segmentation.
Yeah, and you jogged my memory, because it was me listening to that podcast, which made me go, oh, well, it's funny that they're interested, they're discussing this, because hey, I'm doing the CSA paper. And this was the interesting thing, when I first got involved in that paper, I dived, because the CSA is very community driven. So people say, hey, we'd like to do these topics, blah, blah, blah. Who wants to commit? People commit their time, they start writing stuff, you have discussions. And when I jumped into that paper, I disagreed with how it's talking about microsegmentation. No, let's rephrase that. I thought it needed to be framed differently, because it very much came from the perspective of, well, there's network segmentation and there's process segmentation, there's container segmentation, and there's app microsegmentation. I was like, what even is microsegmentation? We need to get into enforcement planes and delivery tags and categorization and policy tiers. And in fact, one of the things that you said in 65 was around north, south, east, west, and distinguishing between IT and OT. And to me, that actually really nicely drives into that question you were having of, how do you do this? Where is identity? What are those constructs? There are many ways in which you can do identity, but for me, if you're going to try to apply microsegmentation across these use cases and align to zero trust principles, I believe the best way to do it is using standards-based cryptography, so public-private key pairs, and to
So
ensure.
you're talking like X509 certs on issued
Correct.
to server services, microservices, workloads, whatever.
100%. And the LinkedIn conversation, once upon a time, I was talking to someone, they're like, yeah, but PKI doesn't work at scale. And I was like, well, yeah, okay, but you can deal with these problems. There's ways to solve it. For example, the way my company does it, we use PKI to bootstrap to the overlay, but then we define services. The services defines whether you get access to something, so that if you want to change your access, you don't have to roll keys and do revocation and all the complexity of PKI. And at the same time as that, whether you're in IT, OT, cloud native, you're seeing so much more X509, JWT, Spiffy Spire, machine identities. The world is starting to cotton on, in my opinion, that is just the de facto standard. When you talk to people around zero trust, they're like, get an identity layer first. Start with humans and then do non-human identities. Like, if you've done that, you solve a whole world of pains. You're able to start layering in the other techniques.
I think that's very true. And I'm not gonna side quest Drew, but I'm gonna slip in this comment. Maybe we can come back around to it later. And then I think that is the underlying problem when we talk about traditional LAN, like local area network based microsegmentation, because we don't truly have unique identifiers. IEEE has told us thou shalt not use MAC addresses as unique identifiers. And that's still an assertion of identity. It's not proof of an identity.
Yes.
We don't have the foundation for anything that we need to build microsegmentation and zero trust in the traditional pure sense of those words, right? Like, we don't have a way for most devices, if we can't put a certificate on them, and a lot of them we can't at this point, we can't uniquely identify that device to put policies, much less something further, abstracted into the device, like a specific, service running on the device. And so I think for me, that's kind of like the crux of the whole people's confusion around segmentation and microsegmentation, zero trust technologies and products for network based things where we're talking about, switching, routing, et cetera, versus the rest of like the work you do, where we do have these constructs and we do have the ability to put this technology closer to the actual device and issue certificates, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm going to agree with that, with one caveat of, in my head, I split the world into two halves. There's the ideal world where I can do strong identity and microsegmentation, and we're slowly moving towards that. And when we do it everywhere, the world's going to be rainbows and unicorns. Until then, there is going to be a whole bunch of use cases like, hey, here's my PLC from the 1980s, and I'm not updating it. That you need to go, well, okay, can I? In fact, this was another thing. After I then reached out, I listened to, I think it was 71, where you were talking about eBPF, and I was like, oh, this is wonderful, because we're starting to work more in eBPF land, and it gives you some really sweet capabilities to do microsegmentation, bring in some further context in an agentless fashion without breaking the kind of low latency requirements you have in OT and some IT environments. So at least it's better than just network segmentation, so that we can we can build the journey. We can help people to go on that micro segmentation path. Because at least one of the things we're seeing, boards are coming on going, you shall do micro segmentation, go figure it out. And people are like, well, okay, this where do we start?
Nobody even knows what it means. I mean, that's the problem, right? That's why we're here today.
Yes.
Based on the conversation so far, if we were able to actually really solve well the identity problem, being able to identify a user, a machine, a process, and put controls around it, would we even need microsegmentation?
To me, microsegmentation is the mechanism through which, or it's part of that mechanism, framework, and controls of how you then enforce that. I'm going to make sure Philip.Griffiths identity gets access to JJ's server, which is hosting a service that
Get
he's able.
off my server.
Yeah, Drew Settle's allowed.
Okay, so microsegmentation is sort of the mechanism by which you're enforcing zero trust policies.
One of the mechanisms, yes, I would agree with that.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I feel like we have kind of a chicken egg problem here then if I don't have, the full gamut of identity provided in my organization, but I need to roll out some kind of microsegmentation framework. Where do I start? What should I be thinking about?
You have almost described the precursor to the CSA Zero Trust paper subsection. How do I roll out zero trust? Step one, what is my protect surface? And let's start incrementally working on, again, it's not big bang. What is my critical use case? In fact, this was a subsection I wrote within the microsegmentation paper, which again, it's not published yet, but you need to think of it from a business outcome perspective. Why are you doing microsegmentation, as JJ was saying?
Because they said I should.
Yeah. Is it because, like, is there a crown jewel that you're like, God? Like, in fact, I'll give an example. Everyone knows Colonial Pipelines. They shut down their OT environment probably not because people got into OT, but because they couldn't charge people. So what about if you made it so that the billing application was microsegmented? So even if someone gets in through the VPN back door, they can't take down your billing system, they can't get into OT. Now, I'm not going to say don't do anything, but do you have to shut down your whole network for like a month or whatever it was? Maybe not. Like, if you're able to start thinking of those business outcomes, what do I need to protect? What is my minimum viable workflow, use case, application, set of processes that I want to ensure I provide the most rigorous security to? Now you're able to start breaking down a complicated problem into consumable chunks and start going, okay, can I put identity on these things? Do I run it as software? Do I do agentless? What are the tools that I have? Again, there's some great CSA content which really flips things from well, let's look at technology and how to use technology, which, don't get me wrong, I love technology, I'm a nerd, but instead, what is the business outcome? What are we actually trying to achieve? What is the revenue we drive? What is the cost we reduce, or what is the risk that we manage, and the business processes that all impacts?
Let's pause for a quick word from sponsor Meter. Meter delivers full stack networking, wired, wireless, and cellular to leading enterprises. It's a single integrated solution with everything included, and I mean everything. ISP procurement, security, routers, switches, wireless APs, firewalls, cellular, power, DNS security, VPN, SD-WAN, and multi-site workflows. Meter has designed the hardware, written the firmware, and built the software. It's a truly integrated solution. And alongside their partners, Meter designs, deploys, and manages everything required at your site or sites so that you get performant, reliable, and secure connectivity. If you're ready for fast, secure, and scalable connectivity without the complexity of managing multiple providers or tools, it's time to check out Meter. Go to meter.com/packetprotector to book a demo now. That's meter.com/packetprotector to book a demo. Thanks to Meter for being a sponsor, and now back to the podcast.
And it's good timing because there's so many initiatives, not just around zero trust, but around operational resiliency and business resiliency. I feel like microsegmentation fits inside of zero trust, which fits inside of this, bigger picture of like mapping to that business objective of Colonial Pipeline's a great example. There's actually the ORF, the Operational Resilience Foundation, or whatever they're called, has some interesting kind of like frameworks and case studies and examples of building that in, but it's like far beyond just what we do in IT and security. It's understanding the business, the customers, the partners, the services, the competitors, so that you can actually leverage them in case of, extreme emergencies, and how to make the whole environment, like the whole ecosystem of business, resilient if one thing happens, that it's not this domino effect, or it's a
Yeah.
controlled domino effect into something else. And so I feel like all of this stuff, it feels like very, on paper, it can feel like very disparate kind of projects and programs, but in reality, they're really kind of just the same thing looked at from different angles, I think.
I agree with that. And actually, funnily enough, I did a talk at the DoD Zero Trust Symposium back in April. It was the third one. And my talk, the title was something along the lines of business outcomes, not zero trust. And I was specifically looking at use cases where our technology being deployed in OT, critical infrastructure, and weapons slash military systems. And when I thought about it, I thought, all four of these use cases, none of them came to us and said, hey, I want zero trust. Hey, I want microsegmentation. They came along and went, we need to connect some stuff and we need to make sure it's like ultra secure and resilient. We need to be able to connect some grid infrastructure. And today we're using a bunch of network stuff, and it's just like such a pain that it causes us downtime. And if there's like a hurricane, it's so difficult to get the infrastructure stood back up. And like all the things that, again, so we delivered a solution, and then they were like, oh, great. And we also got zero trust and microsegmentation. Cool, wicked. But it wasn't actually people asking for that. It was solving business challenges that was complicated with a traditional network approach, because IP addresses don't really scale. They're not really automated, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
I guess so. What I'm taking away from that then is to not approach it as I need to do zero trust and microsegmentation, but I need to build resilient networks that protect critical assets. And in the process of doing that, what I'm sort of coming to is a microsegmentation slash zero trust kind of model.
With what, at least one caveat, that if you're in the DoD, you have a mandate to do zero trust, you probably also want to do it, because otherwise someone's going to fire you.
Some of you are voluntold.
Right. Right. But it does, I mean, it's a typical sort of thing you hear about a lot in IT, that it does need to be tied to some kind of measurable business outcome.
For sure. So actually, before I became a technology nerd, I used to work for a systems integrator doing project and program management. And we would roll out transformation projects. No one cared what the technology was. It was all about, well, what are we achieving for the business? What's the outcome? And through
Mhm.
this journey that I've been on, it's all, you've always got to tie it back to that. And in fact, even better, if you do tie it back to that, when you speak to the executive project, or the person that has the budget and the power, they're gonna be like, oh, you do these things for me, brilliant. Yeah, go do your wonderful technology stuff, because you're going to deliver stuff which is tangibly useful for me. So it's going to be, way quicker to get the budget, the resources, the executive buy-ins, so that you can do this stuff well.
So, based on some of the notes we have here, one of the things you were looking to do with this microsegmentation CSA paper was kind of reposition things from thinking about like building microsegmentation around network host and container, and tie it more to concepts around things like enforcement planes, traffic categorization, and policy granularity tiers. And just to help us sort of put some meat on the bones here, could we kind of walk through those, sort of three main big ideas and see how they shake out?
Yes. So if you start to break those down, policy granularity is starting to look at the kind of attribute based approach, where I can say, at Philip has access to at HR application during business hours, rather than Philip's IP address is able to access the IP address of the application whenever he feels like it. Like
And at Philip, would I be tying that to something like credentials in Active Directory, or an agent on your endpoint, or a
there is
cert?
definitely an identity somewhere, whether that's coming from Active Directory, or I've got PKI, or a combination of both,
Okay,
YubiKey, whatever. Yes, definitely some strong identity, and then the attributes and the policy as to how, when, where I should be able to access those limited services. So it's very much just in time, just enough.
got it. And
Um,
again, moving away from doing this as an IP-based identity signifier.
Correct. Yes. And then the enforcement plane is, okay, how are we doing that? Are we using an overlay network? Are we using eBPF? Are we using a firewall? Are we using a host-based piece of software, which is looking at runtime processes? There's a whole bunch of ways you can do it. Again, various things have pros and cons, but then that ties into what is the business outcome that I'm actually looking to achieve, because then this starts to tell me if I need to do X, Y, Z, then I need to be able to enforce it in this different ways. I need to ensure I can categorize traffic, I can put tags on things, and move into that more tying the business policy into how I'm doing things.
Now, what do you mean by categorizing traffic?
It could be as simple as different types of application flows. Maybe Philip's allowed to do HTTPS, but I'm not allowed to do SSH because I'm not an engineer. I can't do bash. God, you do not want me getting access to those resources. It could be that I'm only able to send traffic. I'm not allowed to receive traffic because I shouldn't be exfiltrating data from the environment. Various different things in which you can categorize that information as to the attributes I have as an individual, whether it's at Philip or hashtag. What do I sit in? Am I sales? I guess I'm in sales. So salespeople shouldn't have access to anything other than a CRM. Simple processes.
Okay, but you are talking about sort of commonly available information. I can see this is, port protocol application traffic. I apply a policy to it. I can see that this traffic shouldn't ever be leaving the org. I can block that at my external firewall, et cetera.
Definitely at least your 5 tuples, but then you're maybe layering on layer 7 and process-based information as well. Again, the world is your oyster. Maybe you start somewhere and you get to somewhere, but definitely, richness rather than just, hey, my IP address communicates to that IP address.
Okay. Hopefully you start somewhere and get somewhere better, not somewhere worse.
And then we also, I just want to make sure we round it out. We also had the enforcement planes. Did we get to that one yet?
Briefly touched on it. So, I mean, although VMware may not, and ESXi might not be the flavor of the month, they've got a pretty decent, with NSX, ability to do host-based microsegmentation. Again, it's a little bit more from the network perspective. You could do it via a zero trust identity-based or identity-based zero trust network overlay. You could do it in kernel with something like eBPF. You could do it in process. To an extent, some of the EDR solutions are like, hey, we can do microsegmentation. We'll look at the processes and maybe we'll block ports or whatever. There's different ways in which you can do it. It's kind of where you're looking at the data, where you're making your decisions from, how you're bringing together the context to then enforce, can a packet flow? Can communications take place? Can a session be connected and established, etc.?
Okay, so I'm looking at doing enforcement sort of at an infrastructure layer, at a workload layer, and at an identity layer.
Yes, those are at least some of them. Again, other people may have opinions as to doing them at rainbow layer and other options, but those are some good categories to start with.
Do I need to go out and buy a bunch of stuff to do microsegmentation in Zero Trust, or it sounds like I've got a lot of this already in house? I've got Active Directory, I've probably got firewalls, I've got host-based firewalls, probably got some kind of EDR. I definitely have routers and switches in my environment. I can, set up VLANs, I can set up ACLs, I can set up access policies. Or is this like, we got to go out and spend $1 million?
Did you just say, hang on, Philip, before you answer that, did you just say ACLs?
I did.
Oh, true. Okay, Philip, go ahead. I'm going to
Is ACLs not allowed? What?
Well, let's say, because I say ACLs sometimes.
Oh.
Philip, we're
I'm disappointed in both of you, but
What do you say, JJ?
ACLs. I don't know. Why do you call them ACLs?
ACL is what you tear if you're an athlete.
Anyway. Okay, Philip, please continue.
So it depends. In fact, side story. I went to the second DoD Zero Trust Symposium. That's how I first discovered it, and then became a speaker in the third one. And there was a really interesting presentation from a guy who worked in, I think it's called NavPaycom. It's basically the Pacific command organization for the Department of Defense, or Department of War, as I now it's believed called. And he was talking about how in Korea he'd set up a zero trust environment using no money, just using existing tools. To which I was like, cool. But if I go back to my comment earlier around the kind of Reddit blog of, yeah, okay, can you actually, like, if you're using for example, a VPN that's going, hey, we're doing zero trust, like, is it really zero trust? Are you really doing microsegmentation? I think in terms of the solution they implemented, it was a decent implementation of NIST 800-207. Does it do some of the enforcement and policy granularity and attribute based context that I would personally like to see in terms of doing zero trust and microsegmentation, particularly being identity first? It's been at least a year and a half since I saw his presentation, but it's definitely not identity first for non-human workloads because he didn't have a non-human identity system, and then you're tying together all these complexities. And there's both cost of licenses, but also cost of time of implementing, of maintaining things. So can you do segmentation with your existing tools? For sure, definitely. Can you do some aspects of microsegmentation with your existing tools? Yeah, maybe, definitely. Could you go out and not buy any tools? Possibly. Maybe we have something in house that you're not actually using. That is not unheard of.
Or not using properly.
Yeah, correct.
I do have one question, Philip, because I do feel like I don't want to like rewind back to the first part of our conversation, but I do feel like that because we don't have an agreed upon definition of microsegmentation. Same with IoT. I mean, we've had this conversation with a few guests that even the ones that work in the IEEE and various standards, the other CSA, the Connectivity Standards Alliance, even the people contributing in there, like they can't come to agreement about what IoT is defined as. And I feel like we have the same problem with microsegmentation. I really like your definition. Are there any kind of bodies, whether it's, a Gartner or a Forrester or one of the federal entities that has, put forth guidance that has definitions that you feel like are relatively accurate and honored throughout the industry as being the definition?
Off the top of my head, I don't think for microsegmentation. For zero trust, I think NIST with 800-207 probably closest. Though I also think they were a bit too generous as to the architectures they're allowed. So there's implementations that don't really take identity as strongly as I would like to see. Particularly, it's a different tangent. I was writing for a blog looking at open source zero trust tools about 6 months ago, and in the network section, they had some italic text was like, networking cannot implement zero trust because it has no concept of identity. To which I commented, yeah, it can if you build identity into the overlay network. They didn't accept my comment, unfortunately, much to my but
well, we do. Even if you just look at it at a very coarse level from 20 years ago with, 802.1x with authentications and radius server, like we do have the option. It's just not. It's one of those really clunky, nasty things.
This gets to a comment that you made earlier, which I agree with, which is, do you have non-spoofable identity that you can do authentication and authorization before this connectivity can be established, or do you just have identity which gives you something? And in fact, I'll give a tangible example. I've been helping a large industrial OEM who's adopting our technology write an RFP recently, and the customer said, hey, can you implement MACsec? And we're connecting inside cabinets which are connected to power systems. We're connecting it back to our SCADA. To which we were like, if someone can get into the cabinet, do you care if it's got MACsec? Because they can just touch the wires. Like, it's not going to do anything. Better, if you have a robust zero trust networking implementation based upon identity, which is otherwise non-routable, least privileged, microsegmentation, like, can they get in and laterally move? This is how you actually reduce the risk. So yeah, we may have had identity in the past, but to me, you have to actually bake it into the network. If in my opinion, but again, I am biased, if you're going to rigorously do zero trust networking and microsegmentation properly. And I mean, this is another topic, going back to one of your earlier things that I get lots of, this is
I'm just excited that you are squirreling and not me, because usually Drew gives me the look and he's like, okay, JJ, we went down the rabbit hole. But no, Philip, love it.
I frequently get into, I'm not going to name them, but there's one person on LinkedIn that's always like, oh, zero trust, bad. and it doesn't include physical security, and it doesn't cover this and doesn't cover that, and it's a terrible name, and the original author, and blah blah blah. And I'm like, dude, like, as you say, IoT, cloud, DevOps, what's the common denominator is humans. We're the problem. Like, you're not going to solve it. The ideal is to have good definitions and standards. This is why I'm a big proponent of open source, because it brings a more standards-based approach. When we say TLS, everyone knows what TLS is. When you say mutual TLS, everyone agrees what that is, because we have mutual standards that everyone implements. Are we going to fully get that for more abstracted topics like microsegmentation? I'm going to keep fighting that battle. Whether we can get everyone to agree and have a single definition, probably not. But again, I'll happily debate and get my typewriter out on LinkedIn, Reddit, or Twitter.
So Philip, first of all, there's lots of acronyms everywhere. JWTs, SPIFFs, SDPs, various TLS flavors, eBPF. Can we talk through some of these acronyms and parse out what people should be thinking about as they think through microsegmentation strategy? Let's start with eBPF, because you mentioned that from we talked about that in episode 71 a few episodes ago. What can we do with it? What's the future looking like?
So eBPF is the extended Berkeley packet filter, which is actually a really old technology. Like they first released it, I think, like 20, 25 years ago, and people just didn't really know what to do with it for like 20 years until kind of, Kubernetes, if anyone heard of that, came along. And then people started going, whoa, this does some really cool stuff. And it's really taken on some hotness in the last few years. Actually, mostly it's kind of used in Kubernetes land, and then most EDR vendors are now using it to kind of hook into the kernel and do stuff without breaking the kernel, like CloudStrike demonstrated on Windows, because Windows isn't good with eBPF yet. It's coming along.
My understanding is essentially that lets you run programs in the kernel without having to get them added to the kernel. You can sort of do it ad hoc, but there are also controls around it, so you don't just essentially introduce a rootkit into the kernel.
Yes, so it's more complicated to use, but then allows you to do some really powerful things, but also be blazingly fast because it's in the kernel, so you don't have to go into user space. And we've started to see it being used more and more on the networking side. Probably the first good implementation, I think, was Facebook with their load balancer. I think they call it Catran or something, and it's like mentioned as a really, really good load balancer because it runs in kernel. And then obviously, as you mentioned on 71, JJ Cisco recently acquired iSurveillance, and you see a lot of their, I think it's called Hypershield, and a few things that they're releasing, kind of builds eBPF capabilities into some of their networking equipment. But as you said, really started from the data center side. We ourselves, the company I work for, NetFoundry, we've started using it in the last few years for a few reasons. But one of the big ones is we had customers coming to us going, it actually links into earlier, I'd like to do microsegmentation and zero trust, but I don't know my protect surface. Can you help me? And then number two, hey, yeah, I like identity. That's really nice, but I've got these PLCs from the 1980s, and I've got these stuff that I can't load software onto. And so we originally started developing it to do stuff like Cloudflare uses a lot of eBPF. Like when they go, oh, we've stopped 4 gazillion terabytes of DDoS attacks. That's the magic of eBPF, of how they're doing that scale. So we initially started doing that to protect our cloud service, but then we started going, oh, okay, how can we do these cool things? And so fundamentally, in fact, where we're doing it is I mean, we can work on the IT side, but we're doing a lot of stuff on the OT side, because there's just so much legacy there where people don't know what they need to protect. They want to do microsegmentation. They definitely can't run agents and everything, particularly when you get into the cell, but also within the industrial zone, which is kind of between the cell and the DMZ within a factory. That's kind of where you run your traditional IT inside the OT zone. And so we went down that path because it enables you. There's a few superpowers. It requires relatively little compute, and these environments are so low on compute. So it's probably like a 10x reduction versus a traditional firewall, which again, you talk to these environments like, hey, we don't want hardware, we can't have new software. So if you can run on something really constrained, very powerful. Number two, because you're in kernel, blazingly fast. So you can be like 10 microseconds. So not even milliseconds. You like really, really, it's like I think of a little U or something, like really, really fast process and response times. Um, and then the ability to layer on, your traditional firewall stuff like mirroring and denial and filtering and other things. And it was interesting because when we started on it, it's like no one's doing eBPF outside of big fat iron data centers. But we think there's some really unique capabilities to solve problems in that space, and that fundamentally it's going to become a de facto technology like JWTs and mTLS and these other things that we already see percolating into other environments. I think it's going to be much more used. Although, again, in my head, this is where you get into the strong identity versus weaker identities, like where you can do X509 strong identity on the overlay. Maybe you don't need ePF. Maybe you just use it for scooping up the packets as part of your ingress or egress, but then you're on the overlay with your identity. If you can't go on the overlay, you want to do a microsegmentation in an agentless manner, eBPF is a wonderful technology to do that.
And how is eBPF manifesting then? Is it that I'm essentially running a piece of software on a separate device and traffic is being sent to it and it's doing the processing, or am I actually running some kind of eBPF program on the device that is actually seeing traffic as it's going through, as opposed to a separate device that I'm shipping traffic to for inspection?
Good question. So the majority of model today is the former. You're running as a default gateway, or you're running on the firewall or next to the firewall, where you like go in and out of the cell, or you're acting in path. But at least you can be in path and not bring it up to user space, so you can do it very fast without interrupting the traffic flows, which is very important in OT environments where you need to be deterministic, low latency. But interestingly, you can start to bring this into lower in the environment. Like maybe you could run in the switch. That was some of the stuff that Cisco announced recently, of being able to do like patching on the fly just via the switch. And that's great because they can offload to the NIC or the DPU, so they can stay wire speed in terms of the performance while doing those checks and validations. You see that a little bit less in the OT environment, because I've not come across an OT switch yet that runs a DPU, because it's marginal cost and it's very cost conscious for the switch side. But then there's an interesting part of, could I run this on my
which is bizarre, because you're talking about manufacturing plants that like literally, if they're down for half of an hour, they lose millions, sometimes tens of millions in the minutes, right? And they don't want to spend more than about $62 on the firewall. It's protecting the thing that could cause that outage. It's unbelievable.
JJ, I've got a CISO for a factory that I want you to talk to convince. But this actually, getting into the nerdiness of eBPF, you could potentially take it down to the endpoint. I'm blanking on the names. Maybe we can put in the show notes. I came across on Hacker News recently some eBPF capability that allows you to run in the host. Again, it was built on the cloud native side, but because it runs eBPF and it's able to look at the packets before they hit the kernel, it can effectively, you can have encryption in your application, TLS, whatever you're using, and it can see the packets before the operating system actually encrypts the application calls, so you can maintain end-to-end encryption but still get visibility of the actual encrypted flows. That is like a magical capability of
You mean the payload, not just headers?
Correct. You can actually see the payload before it gets encrypted. So you're not breaking end-to-end encryption. You're just doing a quick intercept of eBPF before it gets end-to-end encrypted before the operating system.
That's elegant. I mean, because I think everybody's coming back. I don't know. We started up this hill 8-10 years ago with SSL TLS inspection. And then at some point in the recent history, just enough things were complicated and or had privacy complications that a lot of enterprises, at least that I work with, have just kind of rolled back down that hill and went, we're not breaking TLS.
Yeah. Well, and
so
particularly
this sounds amazing.
TLS 1.3 makes it even more complicated and hard to do. So yes, I mean this is where I see the future, where you almost have a combination of eBPF and an identity-driven overlay. So you can do that quick pre-capturing on the endpoint, and then you shove the packets onto the identity-driven zero trust overlay. So you have zero trust principles everywhere. You have strong micro-segmentation, and yet you have strong visibility as to the actual flows which are taking place. So if some malicious actor is trying to hack the PLC or do whatever, you go, whoa, okay, remove their access, put them into a honeypot. Like you take your actions, you can remediate. But we're not. The future's already here. It's just unevenly distributed.
So I feel like I see this future. We keep, I don't know, I'm in the island by myself and I'm the royal we, but I feel like in the networking side, we keep trying to figure out, how to bring this construct of true air quoting microsegmentation where we can get these deeper levels of control, this more granular control into the networking world. But then it also feels like the answer is don't worry about the network. Like when we get to the point where we can have devices, you keep kind of referencing and using the examples of like OT devices. And I was actually one of the lead authors on that Cloud Security Alliance OT ICS paper. And I did the same thing you did because, the first, concepts of it, basically I said, I'll help with this. I got asked to help. I'll help with this, but it has to be actionable because I'm not going to write a paper that's supposed to be actionable that says implement microsegmentation in your OT environment without explaining what you can do, what you can't do, where you can do it, and how you can do it. But there's all of these things still that we're going to be like legacy things on the infrastructure that we're going to be stuck with, whether it's manufacturing, utilities, just random IoT stuff that don't have identity baked into them at this point.
Yes.
But do you see this future where we get to the point that kind of like perfect future picture you were describing earlier of we do have strong identity for everybody and everything, and then we can just take the network out of it because other things are making the policy decisions about what can get where?
Yes. So I'm going to ignore the OT bit for a second and come back to that and say, yeah. Look, so in fact, the company that I work for, our vision ultimately, and this is decades out, but ultimately every single application comes with its own embedded identity and zero trust network overlay. Because then, yes, I need a network, but I don't give a flying monkeys as to what that network is, where it is. I don't care about SD-WAN. I don't care about load balancers. I don't care about public DNS. The application carries its own private micro-segmented least privileged network. And if someone hacks one side of it, what do they get access to? The other side of that application and only what is allowed in that application. And even if you get on the host, you can't scan for the application because there's no listening ports on the underlay host at all. That's not going to happen overnight. That is a long journey, but it's a very powerful future. When you get into OT, again, you're going to have such legacy and brownfield environments. To me, and again, this to me is where the power of eBPF together with identity-driven zero trust networks comes in, because now you can implement those. You can say, hey, I'll do IT/OT convergence. I'll do secure remote access. I'll connect this factory to that factory, whatever. But then on ingress or egress to the overlay, then you can do your layer 7 inspection. You can do your deeper checks as to whether malware's being injected or someone's doing a incorrect modbus command or whatever that case may be. Maybe you also record the data so you have variability, veracity, etc. So you can have the integrity side without impacting the availability and safety of the system. So I do believe it's possible, but particularly on the OT side, it's just going to take time. But again, we're already working with some of the largest industrial OEMs that are starting to build it into their industrial network routers, industrial firewalls, and so to me, it's coming, but it's just their timelines are slower because when you build a factory, you're talking about 3 years or whatever to build that factory. So your decisions,
Well,
your
some of that stuff, manufacturing OT, it's there for 10, 15, 20, 50 years when you get into utilities.
Yeah, I appreciate your enthusiasm, Philip, but legacy and brownfield is also a serious problem on the IT side as well. Maybe overlays are an easier way to bring us toward that glorious future, but also still an issue.
But I feel like it's possible. So we've talked on this podcast about the Matter protocol from the Connectivity Standards Alliance, the organization that, is responsible for Zigbee and other stuff. And they have an entire PKI infrastructure for their IoT devices, a whole ecosystem, several, well, at that time it was like 5 or 7, but it's grown since then, organizations authorized to act as CAs for that. So I feel like that's a fantastic model. It's in the consumer space right now for IoT, but I feel like there is hope. We can do this. So I'm sharing your vision of, we will get from point A to point B, but I also think that people, enterprises, professionals need to be educated enough to start voting with their wallet and to start asking for these things. Yes. And, not buying the cheapest whatever to stick on the network for whether it's OT, IoT, facilities management, et cetera. Yes. So we do have a long road ahead of us. I did want to hit on one last little thing as we're wrapping up, and that's that one of the things you mentioned with the Cloud Security Alliance was SDP, mTLS. Can you give us like a little thumbnail with that? And it's, I think you're working on the new version of that paper. There is a current version that's a few years old, but just kind of like, what is SDP? What is mTLS? How does that fit into some of the microsegmentation conversation?
Yeah, so SDP is software-defined perimeter, which started 10, 15 years ago. Initially focused on client-server connections and specifically how we could build communications. It came out the Jericho form, which is actually a lot of root of zero trust principles, but around really 5 core principles of how do we make the infrastructure invisible, how do we implement mutual authentication encryption, how do we release privilege, how do we do dynamic enforcement, and how do we apply connections to the application layer. And so as people maybe thread in their head going, oh, this is a lot of the bullet points we've discussed today. Unfortunately, in my opinion, SDP as a concept got really tied up with 1 or 2 specific vendors that specifically implemented SPA, so first packet authenticate or single packet authenticate, which are interesting techniques. But this was one of the reasons I got involved, because you look at the wider landscape, there's a whole bunch of tools that effectively do SDP without doing SPA or FPA. And some of them do it better or worse. Maybe some of them hit all 5, maybe some of them hit 4, 4.5, maybe some of them 3. Something like Google Beyond Corp is probably like 3 of them. But effectively, we're seeing these techniques which enable us to ensure the applications stay dark, unreachable, unroutable, unless we've gone through that authentication, authorization, and then create private connections to them. That levers well into mutual authentication. This is effectively the idea that instead of me just checking your authenticate, like old banking apps would be like, oh, okay, you're my banking app. But the banking app didn't know I was Philip. mTLS ensures I know it's the banking app and the banking app knows it's me. And therefore, we do a bi-directional connection because we've both established we can trust each other because we've both got a key and a certificate. And it is way more secure than just assuming one side's trusted. That's not zero trust. That's a lot of implicit trust. And so,
what does the M stand for in the mTLS?
Mutual TLS.
Mutual. Okay.
Yeah. And so it builds upon a lot of the things that we've been building for the last 15 years, I guess, since Let's Encrypt came out, and then TLS started becoming popular, and therefore saying, okay, let's encrypt everything. But now it's like, yeah, let's make sure both sides are trusted. And this is where identity becomes important, because you need identity to do mutual authentication. And so you start seeing, okay, now we're on a slippery slope to properly implementing zero trust and microsegmentation. But then there's some other layers and flavors to wrap into it.
So this has been a question I've had. You're a perfect person to answer this, I think. When I first read the SDP paper, so that software defined perimeter, and it talked about like single packet authorization and introduced mTLS, et cetera. Now I don't work in this space, so maybe this is an ignorant question. But it looked like to me, instead of the world we live in where we've got like, public DNS entries that kind of expose different services and servers and resources out on the internet, an SDP architecture would obscure that, and not in a security by obscurity, but those things wouldn't be really accessible from, a remote or maybe even an internal request until this authentication has happened, which to me sounds like, a new, much better version of things like, port knocking and other sort of legacy. Is that kind of where this is
Yeah,
meant to
I
fit
would
in?
say that's more or less correct. Again, it depends the technique that you're using, but yes, definitely SPA and FPA have that approach that if you haven't authenticated, because port knocking was you have to guess the port and then it will allow you in. SPA then uses PKI to make sure you've got an identity, and if you don't, they're just going to black hole the packets. But then there's other techniques where you can do authentication authorization before connectivity, and therefore no packets are allowed in at all. There is no public DNS. You have to authenticate to the overlay first, and then we're going to build a private connection, mutLS end-to-end encryption between the initiator and the acceptor of the connection. And so I'd say there's a journey and maturity in that, and thus more abstraction of other network layers. But that's definitely the journey we're going on, so that again, I'm not going to say there's no attack surface. There's always things to attack, but you reduce that possible attack surface more and more.
Well, Philip, I feel like we could probably go on for another hour, but just to save your voice and everybody's ears, let's wrap up on where can folks find you online? Where can they read your work? How can they get in touch with you if they are so inclined?
Yeah. So Philip Griffiths on LinkedIn. I think it's Philip L. Griffiths on Reddit if you want to see my rants. The CSA, I mean, just reach out to the CSA. It's an incredibly open community. You're able to enjoy, just join calls. You're able to give your opinions, contribute to papers, and we love to have more people involved, more opinions, more contributors. And then in addition, the company I work for, NetFoundry, we're just releasing in alpha a capability called ZLANs, which builds some of this eBPF based microsegmentation discovery capabilities for both OT, IT, etc. We'd love to have people test it, give us feedback and insights as we move forward with that if people are interested. So feel free to hit me up in any of the places that I comment.
Okay, if they want to play around with what's called ZLANs.
ZLANs, yeah, a cute. So, okay, backstory. Obviously, microsegmentation lands, right? But our open source project is called OpenZT.
OpenZT.
So we put Z's on everything. Like we created an SSH version, so we got ZSSH. We put our technology inside Kube Cuttles. We called it Kube ZTool. So yeah, we put Z's everywhere. If you see a ZT sticker, that's my kids putting it on something they shouldn't.
Nice. Awesome. Well, thank you, Philip, for joining us for this episode of Packet Protector. This was a fun conversation, and we'll have all the links that we talked about in the show notes that accompany this podcast. As always, thanks to you for listening. If you have a topic you want us to cover, or a comment, or a correction, or a question, you can reach out at packetpushers.net/FU. We do love follow-up. We appreciate when listeners reach out. And just to let you know, Packet Protector is part of the Packet Pushers podcast network. There are more than a dozen technical podcasts for your professional development on networking, security, IPv6, DevOps, and more. We've got an industry blog, 2 weekly newsletters, our community Slack group, a YouTube channel, and an IRC group. It's all at packetpushers.net, all free with no login required. As always, we really appreciate your time.